Hello everybody, before we dive into today's video, just wanted to briefly mention today's video is brought to you by the historic city of Quincy, Massachusetts, where I am presently in the Richardson wing of the absolutely gorgeous Thomas Crane Public Library. The city is home to the Adams National Historic Park, which preserves the home of Presidents John Adams and John Quincy Adams, two of America's founding fathers, and both of whom were pivotal to an insane number of elements of the United States' rise and development, as well as were a part of some rather interesting and oft-forgotten stories along the way, such as that time Ben Franklin and John Adams slept together and the hilarity that ensued. In Quincy, you can explore the birthplace of these iconic individuals and walk the same halls that they once did, immersing yourself in the beginnings of the United States. But Quincy isn't all about the past. It's a city that beautifully blends history and present-day adventures and experiences, from the iconic USS Salem to the stunning views of the Blue Hills and architectural elegance of the old City Hall and this very Thomas Crane Library. There's something here for everyone. And let's not forget the Epicurean delight that is Quincy's food scene, with an array of global and local flavors. It's a culinary journey that you can't miss. To discover more about what Quincy has in store for you, check out discoverquincy.com. It's time to step into history and create some unforgettable memories. Now let's get into today's video. When thinking about the various elements that went into the United States declaring independence, we tend to think of things like the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, and the tea tax that led to the Boston Tea Party. But these were things that were more in the vein of, this is the last straw, and all a symptom of the real problem. As the colonies started to grow and prosper, Parliament across the pond and the homeland both began wanting to take advantage of this in generating revenues for Britain, as well as to try to suppress some of this in other areas where the British American colonies were now threatening the parent nation's own industries. A remarkable feat for settlements so relatively new on the world stage. This now brings us to the story of today, John Winthrop Jr. and the first known operational ironworks in America, the Braintree Furnace. This furnace spawned an industry that within a century saw the colonies supplying 1/7 of the world's supply of iron and iron-based product, surpassing Britain's own production. This all led to Britain passing one of the early acts that helped spark the revolution, the Iron Act of 1750, intended to severely suppress American iron manufacturing. Now, if the name John Winthrop sounds familiar, it's perhaps because of the more famous John Winthrop today, one of the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, governor, and one of the most influential men in the early colonization of the region. But his son, John Winthrop Jr., while less remembered today, was arguably just as influential in not only helping to establish the Connecticut colony, but more important, helping the colonies go from fledgling groups scraping by to leveraging the region's natural resources and encouraging highly skilled scientists and workers to come to America, all helping to put the colonies on the world stage of industry. As we'll get into in the bonus facts later, he also tirelessly worked to make sure no accused witch in Connecticut would ever be executed, and ultimately put an end to witchcraft trials in that colony. John Winthrop Jr. was born in England on February the 12th, 1606. His early life included some of the best schooling Britain had to offer, including studying law and the sciences, the latter of which he'd take extreme interest in throughout his life. He also had some adventures in France with the Duke of Buckingham in providing aid for Protestants there, and then beyond traveled to Turkey, Italy, and Holland. During all this, and indeed throughout his life, he continually buddied up with scientists and alchemists everywhere he went, as alluded to, eventually using these contacts to encourage as many possible such expert minds to come to America. In all this, he hoped to create a haven for scientists and alchemists the world over to come study and advance science and industry in the colonies. On that note, he returned to England in 1629, just as his father was preparing to head to America to help found the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the spring of 1630. At this point, Winthrop Jr. initially chose to remain in England to oversee the family businesses. And as an interesting little aside, he would soon get married to his cousin Martha, with the pair from here occasionally writing each other in a code that wouldn't be broken until relatively recently. Although, unfortunately for the couple, just 4 years later, both Martha and his son would die in 1634 because as the past was the worst. But before this, at the age of 25 in 1631, Winthrop Jr. and family joined his father in Boston. This was a period of the Great Migration where in the span of only about a decade, some 20,000 or so people immigrated to the region. Along with the influx of humans, what came with them was a steady supply of various needed items such as tools and building supplies and the like, with iron, steel, and glass being particularly prized. However, in the lead up to the Civil War in England between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians, a byproduct of this was a significant reduction in the influx of immigrants bringing various iron-based building supplies and tools with them, as well as investments in the new colonies also taking a nosedive around the same time. This was all a major problem in not just stalling building growth, but also in that the budding industries in the nation, like farming, fishing, timbering, trapping, whaling, textiles, and shipbuilding, among many others, all required iron-based items on some level, from nails to horseshoes to plows to hammers to simple pots for cooking. In short, the colonists needed ironworks, but quite literally had no one that knew how to make and run one, let alone the needed equipment to do it. While you might think this was all a massive oversight in planning the colonies, when the Massachusetts-based settlement was first established, similar to early efforts in Virginia, there were plans in place to build up all the industries that would be needed to be completely self-sufficient and not depend on anything from Europe. For example, some of the early groups very deliberately included individuals with expertise in such things as glassmaking, wool processing, and making of linen and the like, lumber experts, experts in shipbuilding, individuals expert in building and operating grist mills, salt making, and even mining. They also knew well they'd need iron, and knew given England's deforestation around some ironworks, the New World with vast amounts of readily available lumber could offer a very lucrative solution if such an industry could be established and their product exported to Europe. In fact, the Virginia Company of London, originally formed in 1606, made it one of their most important goals to establish iron manufacturing in their Virginia colony, with some early efforts towards this in Jamestown. The famous Captain John Smith even wrote they'd managed to make little chisels from local ores, likely done in a small bloomery furnace not unlike a blacksmith's forge. Efforts to industrialize things began ramping up all the way back in 1619 thanks to Sir Edwin Sandys when he got elected as the Virginia Company treasurer. Beyond things like sending over 10,000 grapevines in hopes of establishing a wine industry in the colony, among several other industries, iron was his chief focus, investing some 5,000 pounds into it, selecting a site at Falling Creek on the James River to create a blast furnace. For those unfamiliar, a blast furnace is a type of furnace used for smelting metals such as pig iron, copper, and lead. As to the blast part, this just references the fact that the furnace uses air injected above normal atmospheric pressure. In an overly simplified nutshell, the general idea is to use some form of fuel for heat, then use flux and ore supplied in one end, then finally shoot in high pressure air, in modern times hot air, to induce a series of chemical reactions on the materials. In the case of iron manufacturing, at the time charcoal, lime, and iron ore were used for this process, with the carbon monoxide produced diffusing into the iron ore and chemically reducing the iron oxides. The result is molten metal, slag, and waste gas. This iron, called pig or cast iron, is typically relatively brittle owing to its high carbon content, so it's usually then further processed in a forge to both lower the carbon content and reduce any other impurities present as needed for whatever grade of iron or steel needed for a given application. While starting in the 18th century, coke began to be successfully used for this process, at this point in history, as noted, charcoal was still the core fuel required, and hence trees were needed to make the charcoal, with the general rule at the time being that close to 1 acre of hardwood was needed for each full day of operating a single blast furnace. Hence why deforestation around ironworks in England was rampant, and why the Virginia Company had such high hopes for extreme profit on such works in their Virginia colony. Thus, the Virginia Company sent over an ironmaster named Benjamin Buett, as well as about 80 ironworkers and equipment needed to build the ironworks, purchased for the princely sum of about 5,000 pounds. Unfortunately for them, Buett either died during the voyage or just after, and many of the ironworkers also perished, and the remaining did not have the expertise to build the blast furnace. As lamented by Governor George Yeardley at the time,
"What will become of the ironworks, I know not, all the principal officers and chief men being dead. We are now in hand to do what possible we can with Captain Blewett's company, having found an excellent water and good ore."
Not giving up, the Virginia Company then sent ironmaster John Berkeley and around another couple dozen ironworkers in 1621. As for Berkeley, with a suitable site in hand, he thought he could have the whole thing built and running by June of 1622. While it is sometimes claimed he and his workers did get the blast furnace going very briefly, there is no concrete evidence of this. And beyond no real documented evidence to date, in excavations of the furnace, no signs of slag or the like indicative of an operating furnace has ever been found. However, from what has survived, they did make significant progress in the blast furnace's construction. So if they got so close, what caused the failure of this first attempt at the iron industry in America? Well, on March 22, 1622, hundreds of settlers were killed in an attack by the Powhatan natives. One individual who did survive the event was Berkeley's son, Maurice, who attempted to complete his father's work on the blast furnace, but his efforts failed in part thanks to the Virginia Company going bankrupt. Going back to the Massachusetts colony, they too had tentative plans to establish an iron industry from near the beginning, bringing over 2 individuals by the names of Malbon and Graves with expertise in iron making in 1629. But little came of this owing to both the extreme expense in creating an ironworks facility and both men not long after separately deciding to head back to Britain. Nevertheless, the problem for the colony was still pressing. Thus, Governor John Winthrop Sr. resolved, with the help of his polymath scientist son, that they should do something about this, with Winthrop Sr. stating,
"We acknowledge with you that such a stable commodity as iron is a great means to enrich the place where it is, both by furnishing this place with that commodity at reasonable rates and by bringing in other necessary commodities in exchange of iron exported."
Winthrop Jr. then began scouting the region, following up on anyone who claimed they'd found the needed mineral deposits, in particular targeting potential bog iron sources. Samples collected, he then tested them, in the process of all this finding several sites for iron smelting and plenty of physical evidence of the viability of such a works in the Massachusetts colony. There were now just 2 problems. Nobody in any of the colonies had the expertise they needed to make and operate an ironworks, and they did not have the money or equipment to get one going. In order to resolve this, samples in hand and with the General Court of Massachusetts in June of 1641 passing the Encouragement to Discovery of Mines, etc. bill, which more or less provided a loose framework to benefits to anyone who wanted to come establish such a works in Massachusetts, on August 3, 1641, Winthrop Jr. headed back to England to get what they needed. Unfortunately for Winthrop, finding investors and individuals willing to try such a venture in the New World wasn't exactly easy. Beyond the British Civil War, the 30 Years' War was also raging in Europe, helping to complicate matters. Undeterred, Winthrop traveled around not just England, but Hamburg, Brussels, Amsterdam, and The Hague for almost 2 years to find what he needed in investment, skilled labor, and equipment. As a brief example of his struggles, in one account in a letter dated May the 20th, 1643 from Joshua Foote, Foote reports he managed to recruit skilled workmen via an allowance while they waited, as well as promises of great pay and benefits in the colonies, but half of them ultimately just ran away. He also stated he could not find a single bloomery man willing to come no matter how much he promised, but that he figured the other workers he had found had enough familiarity that if they, to quote, join all workmen's heads together, they could probably figure it out because a smith, after a little teaching, will make a bloomery man. On the investor side, while it took some work, thanks to the diminishing forests in England needed for iron making and the seemingly endless forests available in America, as well as the incentives from the Massachusetts government, which after a lot of wrangling after the fact would eventually include such things as a 21-year monopoly on iron making in the Massachusetts colony, Winthrop Jr. was eventually able to get investors to form the Company of Undertakers of the Iron Works in New England, with the largest investor being one of the most prominent English iron manufacturers, John Beck. In all, while exact estimates vary today, the company seemingly raised in the ballpark of £15,000, or about £2.3 million today, to create the first ironworks in America, as well as appointed John Winthrop Jr., who was also an investor, as the manager. And so it was that in the spring of 1643, with men, money, and needed equipment and tools to build the blast furnace acquired, the group set sail for America, intent on getting the blast furnace operational before winter. The problem for them was that, according to Winthrop, in a petition to Parliament asking for a £1,000 recompense, customs officials held them up for many days before allowing them to depart. While this may seem a minor thing today, at the time, and with technology of sailing vessels of the era, this actually ended up being a huge deal. In a nutshell, it resulted in them losing the formerly favorable wind, with the result that when they were allowed to leave, they spent about a month and a half doing nothing but sailing around not far off the coast of Britain until the winds finally shifted. In the end, even though they initially were set to leave in spring, they didn't manage to land in Massachusetts until the fall. Further, upon arrival, because of how long the journey had taken, many of their workmen were in extremely poor health and needed time to recover before they could really get to work. Not totally idle, Winthrop Jr. immediately set about scouting to finalize the location they'd build the ironworks, considering water power available, worker housing possibilities, what other supplies and materials were available nearby, available iron deposits, lime, forests, and finally, local markets and shipping possibilities. The site he finally settled on was on the bank of what would later be called Furnace Brook in present-day Quincy, Massachusetts. And so it was that just before winter, as the workers regained their health, they got to work, supplementing the 5 tons of needed cut stone they'd brought over for the furnace with local granite, which, as a brief aside, the quarry much later created in Quincy to take advantage of this natural resource ultimately spawned the creation of the first commercial railroad in the United States. In any event, the workers also began felling timber, building a dam, water wheels, gathering bog iron, etc. While all of this was happening, the undertakers and general court negotiated the final contract with the colony, which, beyond the aforementioned monopoly on ironworks for 21 years in Massachusetts, exempted workers from any military service requirements and exempted the company from taxes in that span, as well as gave them ample land to build the facility on and for workers to live in and the like. However, in exchange for such favorable terms, the company was also required to meet the needs of the Massachusetts colony first before they were allowed to export any iron. On top of that, a maximum price was set on what they could sell their iron for in the colonies. This ultimately ended up being more of an issue for the undertakers than they initially realized, for a rather interesting reason that had nothing to do with the actual price set. More on this in a bit. But for now, details hammered out and construction complete, by May of 1645, the first confirmed operational blast furnace in the American colonies, the Braintree Furnace, went into operation. Things were not, however, smooth from here. To begin with, once they started producing pig iron to sell, the major issue with having to meet the needs of Massachusetts first came to the forefront. You see, most in the colonies had no money. That's not to say they didn't have ample valuable goods in some cases, but very little actual physical money, with the economy in the region at this time primarily built off the back of bartering and trade. This left the undertakers a product to sell, but a customer base that could only pay in goods, something the undertakers had little interest in, given converting those goods to cold, hard money required establishing some form of trade syndicate to transport the goods abroad. The undertakers did attempt to argue this point to the Massachusetts court, but the court fired back that they more or less did not care and would not allow the ironworks to only accept money as payment.
As we used to say, if a man live where an ox is worth but 12 pence, yet it is never the cheaper to him who cannot get 12 pence to buy one. So if your iron may not be had here without ready money, what advantage will that be to us if we have no money to purchase it?
Further, while the blast furnace was operational, the ironworks didn't yet have forge facilities to convert the pig iron into bar iron, which could be made into all manner of useful things. Thus, while the pig iron they produce could still be relatively valuable if they could export it to places that did have forges, it wasn't nearly as useful in the colony itself yet at this stage, nor as valuable as it could be. On top of this, the undertakers were also not pleased with the output at the Braintree blast furnace, owing to lower deposits of bog iron nearby than expected, as well as issues with the water power supply available at the location. While they had dammed the furnace brook to create a pond nearby to help with this, the water store created was not as much as they had expected either. They further had expectations that the first blast furnace would have been operational much sooner than it was, and that relatively quickly a forge and other ironworks would be built after. With all the issues facing the venture and somewhat losing interest in favor of other ventures, now that this one was well on its way to being established, Winthrop Jr. sent his uncle, lawyer Emmanuel Downing, to England to update the undertakers on everything with the works, as well as to express his desire to be replaced as project overseer, with his suggestion being his uncle Downing for the job. However, when Downing arrived, he found that the undertakers were already in search of a replacement, as they were unhappy with how things were going, and that, as a fellow investor, they could not exert as much control over Winthrop Jr. as they could over an employee overseer. As for Winthrop's replacement, they ultimately settled on the aptly named Richard Leader. Downing wrote to Winthrop Jr. when he learned of all this,
I told them I was well assured Mr. Leader should be a welcome man unto you, for at my coming thence you expressed your desire to me that myself or some other would undertake the business. Then Mr. Leader told them that he would not meddle with any undertaking of their business without your free consent and contentment. For so in private he had promised me to express himself before them all, which he performed very honestly. So in the end we concluded of a letter to be sent unto you under all our hands in a way of thankfulness and engagement to give you satisfaction.
As for Leader, he was, much like Winthrop, a businessman with some familiarity, though not expertise, with ironworks, seemingly just based on his experience as an amateur scientist, also like Winthrop. Unlike Winthrop, however, Leader would simply be an employee, though a well-paid one, at £100 per year, free transport for his family and servants to America, and the company agreeing to build him a house and supply him various things like a horse and cows in exchange for agreeing to manage the venture for 7 years. When Leader arrived at the Braintree Furnace in the summer of 1645, his first order of business was constructing a forge to convert the pig iron to bar iron. Unfortunately, given the water power issue at the Braintree Furnace site, building a forge on site was not an option. After some scouting, they began construction on the forge at the nearby Mononoquat River about 2 miles away, though this location was poorly suited given the terrain in between. However, Leader had little choice given it was the closest he could find with adequate water power available. And so it was that in relatively short order, the forge was operational, including utilizing a massive 500-pound hammer. Simultaneous to all this, because iron deposit levels and water power were not as high as hoped at the Braintree Furnace, he also began scouting for an alternate location to move the blast furnace and forge to, eventually finding a spot Winthrop hadn't considered north of Boston in Lynn, present-day Saugus, along the Saugus River. Like the Braintree Furnace, it also had ample lumber available with, again, about an acre per day needed for operation, more bog iron closer by in ponds, riverbeds, and the like. Further, during high tides, boats could even come right up to the ironworks for shipping needed supplies in and their product out. They also had, after creating a needed dam, enough water power to power 7 water wheels, a significant upgrade from the previous facility. The one issue with the site was the lack of readily available limestone for flux, but Leader & Co., seemingly with the help of Winthrop Jr., got around this when, through some experimentation, they found that an igneous rock, gabbro, worked well as a substitute flux and was more readily available in the nearby Nahant. And so it was that site-settled Leader purchased 600 acres in the region and moved blast furnace and forge operations there, with everything up and running in 1646. As alluded to, the Saugus Ironworks was an upgraded facility in a number of ways, not just able to produce pig iron from the blast furnace on site, but also ultimately had molds for creating things like cookware, as well as could forge things directly on site. And not just creating bar iron for sale to blacksmiths for making really any refined iron-based product, but the ironworks eventually included a rolling and slitting mill to directly make various staples of construction and industry at the time, like horseshoes, wagon tires, axes, nails, bolts, saws, and the like. Noteworthy, at the time, there were only a handful of ironworks of this level of sophistication and capabilities in all of Europe. In all, once ramped up, this facility produced just over 1 ton of iron per day of operation and managed to operate for some 24 years. From here, the workers from the Braintree Furnace and the Saugus began training others up in the craft, including many indentured servants. Most pertinent to the topic at hand, following the Battle of Dunbar in 1650, several dozen Scottish prisoners of war were forcibly made indentured servants and sent to work at the Saugus Ironworks in the colonies for a set period of usually about 7 years. Also around this time, in 1650, Leader, who was unhappy with how the undertakers were treating him despite his very obvious successes, was replaced by John Gifford and William Aubrey. Some of those involved also eventually began to build other forges and furnaces, like the nation's third operational ironworks in Taunton, established by Ironmaster James Leonard in present-day Raynham, Massachusetts. This one was in operation for an incredible 220 years. Another early significant ironworks was in Russell's Mill in Dartmouth, established by Ralph Russell, another of the ironmasters from the original Braintree Furnace. Winthrop Jr. himself notably went on to help found an ironworks in New Haven, Connecticut as well, and the industry grew from there. Beyond the boon to the rising industrial might of the United States, this also began to subtly change its character. At an ever-increasing pace, the colonies were no longer being populated by Puritans looking to create a so-called city on the hill, but by people with different ideals who often ran afoul of Puritan laws and otherwise were not there for religious reasons, but, as more was of interest to some of the investors behind the early colonies, there to make money and create a new life for themselves. To try to get around this issue, in the early going, Governor Winthrop Sr. treated the undertakers to either find more moral workers or at least require workers to undergo religious instruction. But the request was denied. There also developed a different problem with the workers as the iron industry began to grow. Some of them were getting rich, especially the highly skilled ones that had bargained for high wages in order to come in the first place. While it may seem rather odd today, the Puritans didn't exactly appreciate these individuals' alleged flaunting of their wealth by wearing fancy clothes and the like, even at one point helping to spur the sumptuary law, which banned wearing such clothing with a 10-shilling fine if caught. To get a taste of it, one such affluent ironworker ran afoul of this simply by wearing great boots in public. Fast forward about a century, and the US's iron industry had a whopping 80 furnaces supplying about 1/7 of the world's iron and iron-based product, a number that outstripped England's own iron production at this point. Iron had also risen to the third largest export from the colonies, just behind lumber and wheat. This all saw the colonies rapidly rising in many industries as a global power, beginning to not only very directly threaten Britain's ability to compete where industries overlapped, but also leading up to the American Revolution, the colonists began trumping citizens back in Britain by average quality of life and wealth metrics as well. As just one small industrial example, around this time, colonial-made ships cost less than half what the equivalent ship made in Britain would cost to construct. Going back to iron, with not just colonial iron exports, but potentially now cheaper manufactured iron goods as well hurting the home colony's business, Parliament passed the Iron Act of 1750. Along with the Molasses Act of 1733, this was among the first in a series of acts that pushed the colonists toward rebellion. As for the Iron Act, the overarching goal was to both further direct American iron exports to Britain instead of elsewhere, while simultaneously trying to suppress the iron industry in America. To accomplish all this, stipulations in the act included things like getting rid of the duties on pig and bar iron imported from America to Britain, as well as banning building any further blast furnaces and related machinery and ironworks in America, particularly also focusing on ironworks that allowed for creating finished iron and steel products. Specifically, the act provided
that such pig or bar iron made in His Majesty's colonies in America may be further manufactured in the Kingdom of Great Britain, be it further enacted that after 24th of June 1750, no mill or engine for slitting or rolling iron, or any plating forge to work with a tilt hammer, or any furnace for making steel shall be erected, or if erected, continued in any of His Majesty's colonies in America.
This banning of the slitting and rolling mills made it somewhat difficult to make basic construction materials such as nails as cheaply as they were previously made using these mills. Instead, they would have had to use such processes as cold chiseling, which was far more expensive. Further, the banning of the rolling mills would have made it so tin plate could no longer be made in the colonies, commonly used in such basic goods as pots and pans, among countless other products. On top of that, without the ability to refine the iron to various grades of steel, they could no longer effectively make so many staple metal items, from axes to hammers to scythes and countless other essential tools. On top of that, any existing such ironworks now needed to be certified by the colonial governors to continue operation and needed to be inspected by local legal authorities to ensure they weren't violating the act. As part of all this, they also wanted a list of
every mill or engine for slitting or rolling iron, every plating forge to work with a tilt hammer, and every furnace for making steel which were erected within their several and respective counties.
All that said, as with many of these early acts, enforcement of them wasn't exactly significant, in no small part because many of the colonial officials were themselves entrenched in the iron industries in the colony, such as Virginia Governor Sir William Gooch, who was part owner of the ironworks in Fredericksville, as well as Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood, who likewise owned the Tubal ironworks, as well as the furnace at Massaponax. And so it was that, as with the equally deemed odious Molasses Act of 1733, the colonists began to more openly ignore the will of Parliament and just do what they wanted anyway, in all creating a rising feeling of ill will towards their motherland. Later acts where Parliament began to include measures for enforcement continued to fan the tinder until it burst into flames at Lexington and Concord, and the Revolution was on. Noteworthy, 7 of the 56 men who had signed the Declaration of Independence owned either iron furnaces or foundries, and without these ample iron-based supplies, there would have been no hope for a successful revolution given war's insatiable need for this metal, something the United States now had ample supplies of and ample skilled workers capable of making anything needed. In the end, while the initial Braintree Furnace was only in operation for a couple years and, for a time, was largely forgotten to history, John Winthrop Jr.'s efforts to get it established and then Leader and others' efforts directly after to grow the iron industry in America from this ultimately helped not only bolster countless industries in America from what they made at the iron works, but also helped lay the groundwork for independence. From here, for much of history since, the United States dominated worldwide iron production, peaking in the 1940s, producing 40% of the world's annual steel supply, and today is still the third largest iron producer of raw steel in the world, producing nearly 30 million metric tons of pig iron and just shy of 100 million tons of steel per year, though in modern times generally producing most of this from recycled iron products rather than from iron ore. And now for some bonus facts. Helping to get the iron industry going in America was not the only significant contribution John Winthrop Jr. made to these colonies. After he first arrived in the colonies, he was elected and served as the assistant to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then went on to found present-day Ipswich, Massachusetts, among several other towns and cities. He also used his scientific knowledge to help establish the salt works in Salem, as well as used his expertise to become a practicing physician. At his peak becoming so popular, he was the chief doctor for an estimated 500 families out of the total of only about 5,000 people in the Connecticut colony at the time, a region he was eventually elected governor of some 18 times until his death in 1676. During all this, he helped secure an extremely generous charter for Connecticut in 1662 from King Charles II. To give a taste of just how popular Winthrop Jr. was in the region, he attempted to resign a few times during his tenure as governor, such as after experiencing some financial downturns and wanting to focus on his own affairs rather than the colonies. But the colonists more or less refused to let him. In this instance, enticing him to remain governor by voting to exempt him from certain taxes for his businesses. 3 years later, he once again tried to resign, but this time they gave him some additional land holdings as well as raised his salary significantly to change his mind. Embedded in all this, beyond his first wife and child dying in the summer of 1634 because the past was the worst, going back to his love of science and deep study of alchemy, over the course of his lifetime he built up a personal library that peaked at over 1,000 books. He also regularly corresponded with many of the preeminent scientists from Europe on all manner of things, even becoming a Fellow of the Royal Society of London for his work in improving of natural knowledge. He also studied astronomy and reportedly briefly spotted what he thought was the fifth moon of Jupiter in 1664, something that wouldn't be confirmed for over 2 centuries more by Edward Barnard in 1892. He also did experiments on everything from practical methods to obtain salt from seawater to mining. As mentioned, also studying and becoming a master of medicine, and in general devoted himself to alchemy, a rather scandalous area of study for some given his religious background. On this note, he was also instrumental in getting rid of witchcraft trials in Connecticut, initially by serving as a consultant in trials and generally doing his best to provide other scientific explanations other than the supernatural. Finally, in his role as governor, he began squashing such trials as much as legally possible. While it isn't really clear today why he was so against trials pertaining to alleged witches, it's generally thought, given his background in alchemy and science, he just felt in these cases there was no actual witchcraft involved, with it all simply a matter of various substances producing different results in humans. No Satan needed for explanation. Noteworthy in all this, before Winthrop Jr., Connecticut was one of the staunchest convictors of witchcraft in the early days of the colonies and was host to the first large-scale witch trials in America, predating the now more famous Salem witch trials by about 3 decades. Further, Connecticut was the first colony in New England to execute an alleged witch, one Alcy Young of Windsor in 1647, whose pleading of not guilty didn't sway the court. And they didn't stop after, from 1647 to 1655, seemingly executing every single alleged witch put on trial for witchcraft, and reportedly also torturing some who refused to confess, with the first known to plead guilty of witchcraft in Connecticut being one Mary Johnson, who, after being tortured extensively, finally confessed to having had sex with demons. She was then hanged on June 6, 1650 after giving birth, as she was pregnant at the time of her conviction. In comparison, Massachusetts tended to acquit about half of those accused of such activities during that span. Back in Connecticut, Winthrop quickly changed things again, as noted, first as a consultant, using his expertise and general giant brain to convince the courts that a given case of alleged witchcraft was actually something else, and then as governor, using his powers there to do his best to make sure all such trials ended in acquittals. Further, when he left for England to secure a royal charter for Connecticut, he also made sure the governor under the charter would have the power to issue pardons to anyone convicted of anything, including witchcraft. A power he subsequently used for every single convicted witch in Connecticut afterwards, starting with Elizabeth Seeger of Hartford in 1666. Speaking of Winthrop Jr. leaving, the witchcraft executions resurged somewhat after Winthrop Jr. departed for England to try to secure a royal charter for Connecticut, which he was, as mentioned, successful at. But while he was gone, the local populace went back to their witch-killing ways, with the last witch executed in Connecticut being one Mary Barnes, with the court decreeing,
Mary Barnes, thou art here indicted by the name of Mary Barnes for not having the fear of God before thine eyes. Thou hast entertained familiarity with Satan, the great enemy of God and mankind, and by his help has acted things in a preternaturally way beyond the ordinary course of nature, for which, according to the law of God and the established laws of this colony, thou deserved to die.
Barnes pled not guilty, but the jury disagreed, leaving her husband a widower and their 6 children motherless on January the 25th, 1663. Unfortunately for all of them, things couldn't be delayed, as Winthrop Jr. arrived back only a couple months later in April of 1663 and resumed his role as governor. Getting sick of it all, in 1669, thanks to the trial of Catherine Harrison of Wethersfield, who was convicted of witchcraft, to try to further squash the whole thing, Winthrop established that there now needed to be multiple witnesses to any witchcraft act, and to the same exact instance. Further, the burden was now to be put on the accusers to prove what they saw, rather than the burden on the accused to prove that they didn't do it. On top of all this, he no longer allowed the admission of evidence based on dreams people had had, which was totally a thing that was admissible before this, by the way. And in the aftermath of Harrison's conviction and him issuing a pardon, he gathered a group of ministers and tasked them with getting rid of all ambiguity of what actually constituted witchcraft, given, for example, some of his own scientific research sure seemed to fall under classical definitions the courts had been using up to this point for witchcraft. Helpfully, one of Winthrop's friends and fellow alchemists, Reverend Gershom Bulkley, led the ministers in question. Perhaps unsurprisingly, their new definition, along with the added rules for the court in witchcraft trials, effectively ended any chance of anyone ever again being executed in Connecticut for witchcraft.